You're better off dead with a face like that, Rafiq Rahman thought. He squinted at the patient, whose skin was a patchwork of bruises and abrasions. An oxygen mask covered his mouth, and tubes rested on his neck brace. Another tube attached to his arm fed him clear fluid from a bag held on drip rail. Rafiq looked out of the window, recognizing the tall, glassy glory of the potential building. Red and white car lights were lit along the road leading to the Euston underpass. Who am I supposed to be visiting? He thought, turning to look at the bed again. The patient's body was inked with tattoos that looked familiar. A serpent, an octopus, barbed wire, and peacock feathers. The unfinished tiger on his shoulder spooked him. He thought it had blinked. Papers rustled and he turned. He was startled to see a nurse with his back to him sitting by a computer terminal. The door opened and another nurse walked into the room, glancing in his direction. "Thanks for covering," the nurse said as the others stood up. "I was just on my way out," Rafiq said. He shrugged at the lack of their response and walked out of the room before the door closed behind him. In the cream corridor, he passed oxygen canisters and medical apparatus with fuzzy labels on them. Feeling giddy, he tried to remember how he'd got there. What did I do this time? Why can't I see clearly? He thought as he walked into a shared ward. He froze. A man in tattered clothes swung his broken arm around his head. Another man, his wide eyes fixed on Rafiq, dragged his distended leg along the floor, and a boy in a dressing gown with a gash across his neck warbled at him. Rafiq backed away, trying to shake the mist from his mind. A man in platform heels and rouge smudged on his lips tried to give him a broken flower, but he wouldn't leave his hands. More patients surrounded him, ignoring a uniformed woman holding a tray of syringes and gauzes. They hissed and whispered, calling out names and pleading with him. They bustled around him as he dropped to his hands and feet, backing away from them like a crab. "I don't want to see this shit." As he thought it, the crowd disappeared, only to be replaced by a man in shadow walking towards him. What the fuck is he doing here? Rafiq asked himself as his father came to a halt. He looked taller than anyone Rafiq had ever seen, the way a father would look like to a child. His eyes, one green and the other brown, shone in the artificial light. He smoothed his receding hair with his palm. His darker eye flickered as he sucked a cigarette, threw back his head, and exhaled smoke. He advanced. "You faggot," whispered his father in English before he switched to speaking in Punjabi. "You bring shame on my family." He kept walking towards him as Rafiq stood up and backed away, not realizing he had gone through the door to the room with the tattooed patient. He looked over his shoulder and called out to the nurse, who continued to stare at the computer screen. Before he could reach her, he had backed into the bed and found himself tugged through the frame, onto the mattress, and flipped onto his back. His heart beat quickly. He thought he wriggled, moaned, and half sat up, but did not realize that his body was still on his back. "Don't let him get me," he tried to say, but his lips felt like they were one. Putting his hand up to shield his face, he could still see his father unbuckling his belt, which coiled into a snake and snapped in the air. The beeps from the heart monitor sped up, and the waveform sporadically peaked. The nurse stood up and pressed the red button. Rafiq wrenched himself off the bed, jumped onto the floor, and was momentarily surprised that he didn't collide with the doctor entering the room. The door closed. Just as he was about to give himself up and ask for help, the room swam in and out of focus, and a haze of dull greys, greens, and blues began to brighten. He surveyed his own hands as they became swollen and bruised. It must be drugs. They'll wear off soon. He stared at the bandaged body and bare feet, with a strange feeling of being both on the bed and beside it. His own stomach, normally the colour of caramel, had turned amethyst. What did I take? Why am I here? The heart monitor began to whine. "Defibrillator," the doctor called out, manually compressing the patient's chest and thumping it once. When it was passed to him, he held up the pads whilst they were being charged. "Clear," he shouted, and pressed the defibrillator down on the patient's breastbone. Rafiq was magnetically drawn back into the patient. Jolts made him jump, and he felt electrified. The third jolt flung him back off the bed and across the room. Heavy footsteps echoed around him, and he turned to face his father, who was accompanied by a taller man. I didn't know he had a twin, Rafiq thought. The taller duplicate merged into the smaller one, and the amalgamation lunged for him. "Come here, you runt," his father whispered. "Go away," Rafiq shouted, as he felt himself lassoed back into the patient. "No, I didn't mean that." A gasp escaped from his unglued lips. He could hear the rustle of clothing, but see nothing, as the room blacked out. Within a blink, Rafiq was beside the bed. He backed away, suspecting that whatever trip he was on had gone too far. He started to tremble, and even the patient was sweating. The tattoo of the peacock feathers swayed. He couldn't see it, but he knew there was also a tattoo of a pair of wings on his back. He knew because he had chosen them. As the doctor continued to shock the patient, Rafiq's chest felt like it was going to implode. He clutched it. No, it can't be. You've got to help me wake up. Please, I'll go to hell." Through the opening between the nurse and the doctor, Rafiq jumped onto his body, fell through it, and sank through the floor. Pastel clouds drifted across his vision. Snapshots popped up. Asphalt pavement, tungsten lamppost, headlights, polished shoes, and blood camouflaging into tarmac. Darkness dragged him down. Rafiq stood up and surveyed the vast expanse of sculpted silver dunes. In the distance, plumes of grey smoke spiraled towards tar-coloured clouds. What happened to the hospital? They must have given me some strong shit. His skin felt like it was crawling. He looked at it as it began to stretch and shed. Rubbing it only made it elongate further. "I swear, when I wake up, no more drugs." He started to laugh at himself until he felt them. Hands from the sand pulled at his unravelling skin, squeezing his legs into a fierce and grainy mummification. As his shoulders disappeared into the quicksand, he was shaken and coughed up. He spat out granules and covered his eyes, taking his arm away only to find everything was a blur as he tried to focus. He fled from the hands of sand, which melted like mercury into oscillating waves. He made his way up the scorching slope with small sinking steps and gasped when he reached the top. Men, women, children, and stray animals, all of whom were wounded, shimmered into view. A man with a twisted neck who had arched himself backwards moved on his hands and feet in the direction of the smoke. Rafiq ran down the dune and cried out to an old woman who had barnacles on her hunched back. When she turned, half of her face was smooth and unlined. The other half was wrinkled and sagging. Her left breast had coal-coloured stains on it. He hurried away. His chest hurt and his heart palpitated through his transparent skin. His ribcage widened and closed beneath a network of veins that made him look a lot older. He blinked a few times, wishing he would wake up in his own bed in London. What did I do to myself? Where the hell? The sand shifted and split. He tumbled down an incline and landed by a wall. "Transgressor," hissed a male voice. It belonged to one of many gnarled faces set close together in the sandy wall. Eyes of yellow, green, and red protruded above pustule-ridden noses and lips. Rafiq backed away as another spat. "Sinner." "Sodomite," another voice hissed. "Who the fuck are you to say that to me?" Rafiq said, getting to his feet and stepping back. They cackled. "Going to the big smoke, are you?" "Why not?" Rafiq asked, aware of how weak his voice sounded. "That's the only place for him." "He's not ready." Dozens of eyes slanted towards the last to speak. He was born ready. They stopped squabbling to bite his unravelled skin. Rafiq snatched his ribbons of flesh back. "You can't help him," one of the voices whispered. "I was just saying." "He's beyond help." Rafiq crawled away from them and they crawled cackling. He stuck his toes into the sand and dug his fingers in to lever himself up. Gigantic blackbirds screeched and dived in spirals above. He felt relieved when he saw them heading away from the smoke. He reached the top of another dune. Out of a low-rising mist, a hand crept towards him. "Help me up, please," a shrill voice said. Rafiq pulled the hand towards him, only to find that there was no arm or body attached to it. Another hand appeared, this time connected to a woman's body. "Thanks for that," she said, taking her hand. When she tripped backwards, he dived forward, only to grasp air. He pulled back as she fell, feet over face and out of sight. Defeated, He shuddered and crouched, picking at the scabs on his knees. His arms were peppered with track marks, and on his left wrist was a creamy slither from one of his suicide attempts. He stood up and continued his ascent into the moving mist. Behind him, those sands had settled. The ground levelled out and was rocky and crimson. He only looked up when he passed a voluptuous woman sitting on a boulder. "Hi, could you tell me where I am?" he asked. She quivered, using her talon-tipped fingers to pull at her shoulder-length hair as if she could make it reach her marshmallow breasts. She cupped her hands over her nipples and crossed her legs. Her eyes rolled back and spun as if they were searching for something inside of herself. He continued to walk across the plateau of silt and soil, arriving at black rocks that bled at the base of gates that towered up into the clouds. Through a crevice that was circled with bones, Rafiq saw an apparition of a man being dragged by unseen hands into a chamber. When the man turned, his face was torn from his skull and he drooled mucus and blood. He reached out to Rafiq with a skeletal hand decked with precious stones. The wind whined, the apparition faded. Rafiq backed away, jerking his head up at the sound of scurrying. Fiends with narrow greyhound heads, long ears and rotund furry bodies swung sideways towards him, leaping and squealing. They simultaneously stopped in mid-air as they were snatched back by thick cords, their open, sickly yellow eyes wider, twisting and salivating as they bared their canine teeth. They twitched their stunted noses and scratched their armpits. The biggest of them dipped, arched its back and crawled closer. Rafiq froze, staring down the precipice as he considered jumping. Light erupted, the fiends recoiled. The ground quaked as if giants were walking on it. The source of the light moved closer, encased in silver armour. Out of the haze, silken gold cloth and 2 pairs of feet in sandals stepped in front of him. He could not see their heads or shoulders. The light rainbowed out. The figures stepped away from the edge and hovered as their wings upon wings fluttered. He knelt in fearful awe, riveted by the great translucent span. He was struck dumb and did not dare to look up. "The gates of hell," said a voice from above, "are closed."